The winter of 1941 settled heavily over Black America, a nation within a nation, watching the world inch closer to catastrophe. In the segregated neighborhoods of Harlem, Chicago's South Side, Birmingham, and New Orleans, radios crackled with news of Europe on fire and empires collapsing. Yet for Black families listening in cramped apartments or shotgun homes, the looming global conflict carried a weight deeper than geopolitics. They understood instinctively that the United States might soon call them to defend freedoms they themselves had never fully experienced. Even before Pearl Harbor, Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier framed the coming test with a clarity white America resisted. If Black men were to fight overseas, then the battle for dignity, citizenship, and equality at home would have to be fought with equal ferocity. December 7th transformed that quiet anticipation into a national uproar. When photographs of burning ships at Pearl Harbor circulated through Black communities, grief mixed with something sharper, a sense of inevitability. Black Americans had fought in every war this country had ever waged, despite broken promises, Jim Crow humiliation, and deliberate exclusion from the ranks of honor. Now, as the Army scrambled to expand, tens of thousands of Black men surged forward to enlist, not merely out of patriotism, but out of a determination to prove, once again, that they belonged on the front lines of American history. Their decision was not simple obedience. It was a calculated act of moral courage, a wager that participation in this global struggle might finally force the nation to confront its own contradictions. Yet before these soldiers ever faced Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, they confronted an American military machine engineered to diminish them. Across training camps from Alabama to California, the immediate reality was unmistakable: segregated barracks, unequal rations, conservative commanders steeped in racist pseudoscience, and a War Department bureaucracy committed to limiting Black troops to labor roles. Many were assigned to quartermaster units, stevedore battalions, or road-building companies on the assumption that Black soldiers lacked the discipline or intellect for combat. Even the few prestigious roles dangled before them, aviation, artillery, tank destroyer units, came only after relentless public pressure. The irony was crushing. The world's leading democracy prepared to fight fascism while upholding its own system of racial hierarchy. Despite these barriers, the mobilization of Black Americans during World War II was unprecedented in scale and energy. Churches organized enlistment drives, fraternities gathered funds for soldier support, and civil rights organizations, from the NAACP to smaller grassroots groups, launched campaigns demanding fair treatment for Black troops. In northern cities, mothers sent their sons to induction centers with pride wrapped in fear, while in the South, many families worried less about the war abroad than the humiliation their children would endure in segregated training camps. Still, they marched forward. Black America saw the coming conflict as a stage on which they could demonstrate their loyalty to the nation even as they challenged its injustice. The Pittsburgh Courier articulated this dual struggle in what became one of the defining ideological campaigns of the era, the Double V: victory abroad against tyranny and victory at home against racism. This slogan spread like wildfire, painted on storefront windows, stitched into banners, printed in pamphlets that circulated through rail cars and barbershops. For many young Black men, the Double V was both a declaration and a shield. It clarified that their service in uniform was not passive acceptance of second-class citizenship, but an act of defiance, positioning their fight on the battlefield and their fight for equality as inseparable fronts of the same moral war. Yet the nation's leaders remained uneasy at the thought of arming Black men. Military planners feared racial tensions within units, while Southern politicians openly opposed any measure that expanded Black participation in combat. Some generals argued that Black soldiers were better suited for menial or supportive tasks, citing outdated and racist theories from the previous century. The result was a cycle of frustrating half measures, piecemeal improvements, small openings, symbolic gestures. Fight for democracy, the country told them, but do so from the sidelines. Even as the Army grew desperate for manpower, Black volunteers were often turned away or left waiting months for assignment, while white recruits shipped out almost immediately. Still, when Black Americans did force open doors, they walked through with determination and skill. Early experimental programs, such as the aviation cadet training at Tuskegee, the formation of segregated tank units like the 761st, and the establishment of black engineer battalions, revealed what many already knew. Given proper training and leadership, black soldiers performed with excellence. The War Department's own internal reports grudgingly acknowledged this truth, even as military culture resisted it. Quietly, in the background, the scaffolding was being built for dramatic breakthroughs still to come. As the nation braced itself for full-scale war, the story of black soldiers was already diverging from that of their white counterparts. For white America, mobilization meant leaving home to confront an external threat. For black America, mobilization meant leaving one battlefield and entering another, with the lines drawn not just across oceans but in hometowns, on military bases, and inside the very institutions meant to protect them. Their journey to the front would be longer, harder, and more morally complex than the country dared admit. And yet, as they stepped onto buses, trains, and troop transports, these soldiers carried with them an unshakable conviction that by risking their lives for a nation that denied them equality, they were not reinforcing its hypocrisy, they were challenging it to rise to its promise. At the segregated induction centers where black soldiers entered the military system, the process of transformation began not with a sense of unity, but with a stark reminder of the racial order they were stepping into. Young men arrived carrying cardboard suitcases or canvas bags, some wearing their best Sunday clothes, others in work boots still caked with the dust of farms and factory floors. They stood in lines that extended down sidewalks and around buildings, waiting to be processed by clerks who often spoke to them with a clipped impatience reserved for the racially marginalized. For many recruits, this was their first encounter with federal authority, and the message was unmistakable. You are here because we need you, but you will serve on the terms we decide. Even as they took the oath of enlistment, the contradiction hung heavy in the air. They were now soldiers of a nation that treated them as outsiders. Military trains carried these new recruits across the country to training camps, most of them located in the Jim Crow South. For Northern black soldiers, this was a jarring descent into a world they had only heard stories about, a landscape of rigid segregation, racial violence, and suffocating social codes. Many arrived at camps like Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Camp Shelby, or Louisiana's Camp Claiborne expecting Army discipline, but not the familiar structures of Southern racism magnified by military authority. Local bus drivers refused to let them sit in front seats. Restaurants outside the bases barred them entirely. MPs enforced Southern custom as strictly as they enforced military regulations. For those who had grown up under segregation, the humiliation was familiar. For those who hadn't, it was a brutal awakening. Inside the camps, the training itself was a study in both discipline and disparity. Black soldiers ran the same obstacle courses, drilled with the same cadence, and handled the same rifles as white recruits. But their experience diverged sharply once training ended each day. Their barracks were older, often poorly insulated, and sometimes lacked adequate heating. Their canteens served lower-quality food. Their recreational facilities were separate and inferior. While white trainees attended advanced schools for artillery, mechanics, or communications, black soldiers were often funneled automatically into service battalions. The implicit message was clear: their labor was valued, but their potential was constantly underestimated. Despite these obstacles, black soldiers forged bonds that strengthened their resolve. Hard labor under the southern sun, long marches through pine forests, and nights spent cleaning rifles built not only military skill, but a shared sense of endurance. They learned to rely on each other, drawing strength from the elders in their units. Men who had lived through the Great Depression, lynching threats, and daily Jim Crow indignities. These older soldiers became unofficial mentors, teaching younger recruits not only how to survive the rigors of military life, but how to withstand the psychological weight of constant discrimination. In these barracks, a unique fraternity emerged, a brotherhood defined by the dual challenge of fighting for a country that marginalized them and fighting to prove themselves worthy of the uniform they wore. Civil rights organizations kept a close watch over the training camps, understanding that the treatment of black soldiers in the military would echo far beyond the war itself. The NAACP dispatched investigators and lawyers to respond to abuses, filing complaints with the War Department whenever segregation turned violent or when black soldiers were denied opportunities promised under mobilization policies. Their presence put pressure on military officials, but progress came slowly. Black newspapers filled with reports of mistreatment, riots, discriminatory punishments, and even the occasional murder of unarmed black soldiers by civilians or MPs. Each incident underscored the reality that the fight for equality was not suspended by wartime necessity, it had intensified. Yet within this oppressive system, pockets of progress began to emerge. Some white officers, often from northern backgrounds or from professional military families, recognized the injustice of segregation and worked quietly to support their black troops. They pushed for fairer promotions, requested better equipment, and held their units to the same standards regardless of race. These officers were exceptions rather than the rule, but their leadership planted the seeds for breakthroughs still years away. Even the War Department, pressured by manpower shortages and civil rights activism, began to experiment with mixed training schools and technical programs that allowed a select group of black soldiers to rise beyond the confines of service roles. Meanwhile, the unfolding global crisis only heightened the urgency of these internal struggles. Every photograph of Hitler's expanding empire, every newsreel of bombs falling on London or Manila reinforced the stakes of the conflict. Black soldiers watched these developments with a complex mixture of patriotism and skepticism. They knew that fascism posed a genuine threat to the world, but they also knew that racism in America was not merely a domestic inconvenience. It was a system capable of violence, exclusion, and oppression on a scale that echoed the very ideologies the Allies promised to defeat. For many black troops, the war offered a chance to expose this hypocrisy to the world and to themselves. By the time basic training concluded, the young men who had arrived at camp as laborers, students, musicians, factory workers, and sharecroppers had been hardened by months of drilling, discrimination, and determination. They had learned to shoot straight, march in formation, field strip a rifle in the dark, and endure the verbal abuse of instructors who doubted their worth. But more importantly, they had learned to see their service as part of a larger struggle, one that would demand courage not only on the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific, but within their own ranks, within their own country, and within their own hearts. Their journey was only beginning, and they marched toward the next phase with a clarity of purpose few armies in history have ever possessed. As black soldiers left their training camps and boarded troopships for deployment, they carried with them a heavy mix of anticipation and apprehension. The docks at Hampton Roads, New York, and San Francisco bustled with soldiers from every corner of the country, but segregation persisted even as men prepared to cross an ocean toward war. Black troops were often herded into separate embarkation lines, assigned inferior sleeping quarters deep below deck, and given duties that placed them closer to the ship's boiler rooms than to its open-air decks. While white soldiers lingered along the rails to wave goodbye, many black soldiers stood in dim holds that smelled of oil and steel, humming hymns or tapping out improvised rhythms on canteen cups to steady their nerves. Their journey into global conflict began exactly as their training had, with inequality shaping every step. Once at sea, however, the rigid hierarchy of segregation met the unpredictable reality of war. In the cramped belly of a convoy ship, when the lights were dampened and the ocean churned with U-boat danger, distinctions of race and rank blurred in the low thrum of engines and the tension of survival. Black stevedores loaded cargo through the night. Black engineers maintained the ship's machinery under suffocating heat. Black infantrymen huddled shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers during submarine alerts, each man listening for the distant thump of explosions that might precede a torpedo strike. Fear was a harsh equalizer. The sea did not care about Jim Crow, and in those moments, neither did fate. Arrival at distant ports revealed yet another contradiction. Black soldiers discovered that many of America's allies treated them with more humanity than the country they served. In England, black GIs were welcomed warmly by civilians who were charmed by their manner of speech, their jazz culture, and their politeness, traits often dismissed at home. British pubs and dance halls opened their doors to all American servicemen, and the British public grew baffled and resentful when American MPs tried to enforce segregation on their streets. In parts of North Africa, black troops found themselves negotiating entirely new cultural dynamics. But even there, they often faced less hostility than they did from white American soldiers stationed alongside them. The dissonance was profound. Abroad, they tasted respect. At home, they faced degradation. The War Department feared exactly this, that black soldiers experiencing fair treatment overseas would return home unwilling to tolerate second-class citizenship. As a result, military police units were instructed to enforce segregation for the sake of order, even in nations where the concept was culturally alien. This led to explosive confrontations. White MPs sometimes raided pubs to drag black soldiers outside for drinking beside white troops. In several towns across Britain, the local population openly sided with black Americans, challenging U.S. military authority and reinforcing to black troops that the racism they lived under was not a universal human truth. It was an American construction. This global contrast sharpened their awareness of the fight they faced both overseas and at home. Meanwhile, in the theaters of war themselves, the contributions of black troops, though often concealed from public view, became indispensable. In the North African campaign, black service battalions built roads through desert terrain that allowed Allied armies to advance. In Italy, black artillery units supplied crucial firepower during the grueling slog up the Apennine Mountains. In the Pacific, black engineer regiments carved airstrips out of jungles and coral, enabling Allied planes to strike deep into enemy territory. These units rarely received recognition, but commanders on the ground knew the truth. Without black labor, logistics, and engineering, the Allied war machine would have fractured under its own weight. The irony was bitter. As white combat troops pushed forward toward enemy lines, black troops often labored just behind them, clearing mines, hauling ammunition, repairing bridges, and burying the dead, frequently under fire. They performed tasks essential for victory, but remained excluded from the glory that victory conferred. Many wrote letters home expressing pride in their work, yet frustration that the nation refused to see them as warriors. Others wrote with quiet defiance, determined to let their actions speak louder than the limitations imposed upon them. For every decorated white unit, there were dozens of black units whose heroism went unmentioned in newspapers or newsreels. Yet even in these unrecognized roles, black soldiers built a reputation for unmatched endurance. Officers noted their resilience under impossible conditions, rebuilding roads washed out by torrential rains, carrying supplies over terrain trucks could not traverse, and standing watch for hours in freezing weather without complaint. This reliability did more than sustain the Allied advance. It forced some commanders to reevaluate their prejudices. Gradually, a realization rippled through the ranks. The ideology that had marginalized black soldiers was founded not on fact but on fear. The men who were once deemed unfit for combat were proving themselves indispensable in every corner of the war. By the time the Allies prepared for their largest offensives, a quiet shift had begun to take shape. Commanders, pressured by manpower shortages and eyewitness evidence of black soldiers' capabilities, started to demand more combat-ready black units. Civil rights activists amplified these calls back home, using the valor and labor of black troops overseas as a moral indictment of segregation. And black soldiers themselves, shaped by months of service abroad, strengthened by the respect shown in foreign lands, and firm in their commitment to the Double V, felt destiny sharpening around them. They were no longer merely participants in the war. They had become catalysts in a struggle for transformation. As Allied commanders prepared for the massive campaigns that would determine the war's outcome, the question of how to use black troops grew increasingly urgent. The Army had exhausted its supply of white manpower, and the scale of upcoming operations demanded every available soldier. Behind closed doors, planners wrestled with their own prejudices even as battlefield realities forced their hand. Reports from North Africa and Italy showed that black units had performed with unwavering discipline under fire, often succeeding where hastily trained white units had faltered. Slowly, the War Department's long-held assumptions began to crack, not out of moral awakening, but out of necessity. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The Army needed black soldiers to win the war, yet its own policies kept them from the front. One of the first signs of this shift emerged in the formation of the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, revived from its storied past for combat duty in Italy. The idea carried deep symbolic resonance. Black troops would fight in a theater known for brutal terrain, grinding attrition, and high casualties. But symbolism alone was not enough to ensure success, particularly when the division's leadership was burdened by white officers who doubted their men before the first shot was fired. Black soldiers sensed this skepticism immediately. Orders were often delivered with an edge of mistrust. Commendations were rare. Mistakes were magnified in ways their white counterparts rarely experienced. Despite these constraints, the soldiers trained relentlessly, determined to prove, perhaps to themselves as much as to their commanders, that they belonged on the battlefield. Meanwhile, a second force was on the rise, the 761st Tank Battalion. Nicknamed the Black Panthers, these tankers had endured endless delays, extra inspections, and humiliating evaluations designed to find fault where none existed. Yet their performance and training was so exceptional that even Patton, known for his skepticism toward black troops, eventually accepted them under his command. He famously told them he did not care what color they were, just whether they could kill Germans. It was hardly an endorsement of equality, but it opened a door that had been sealed for decades. The men of the 761st stepped through it with a mixture of pride, urgency, and the heavy awareness that they would be judged not only as soldiers, but as representatives of their entire race. Across the Atlantic, another group was nearing its moment of reckoning, the Tuskegee Airmen. After years of fighting to even exist, battling racist science, political obstruction, and military reluctance, their red-tailed fighters finally took to the skies over Europe. Flying escort missions for bomber crews, they quickly earned a reputation for extraordinary discipline and precision. Rumors spread among white flight crews that the Red Tails never abandoned their bombers under fire, a myth that, though not perfectly accurate, reflected a deeper truth. These pilots understood that any failure would be seized upon as proof that black men did not belong in the cockpit. Their excellence was both survival and protest, a declaration written not in pamphlets or speeches, but in contrails across the German sky. Back home, the accomplishments of these units fueled a growing surge of pride and agitation in black communities. Letters from soldiers circulated through newspapers and church bulletins, telling stories of heroism, close calls, and quiet victories. Families gathered around kitchen tables reading each word as if decoding a secret message. We are proving ourselves. Ministers built sermons around these emerging legends, reminding congregations that their sons were reshaping the nation's moral landscape with every mile marched, every shell fired, every sky crossed. The military's attempts to suppress or downplay black achievements only strengthened the determination of black journalists to document their stories. The Double V campaign evolved, no longer just a slogan, but a movement tied to real names, real units, and real accomplishments. Yet the resistance from within the military establishment remained fierce. Some commanders blamed black units for setbacks even when their white counterparts had performed no better under similar conditions. Others withheld commendations or limited promotions, fearing backlash from segregationist politicians. Black officers faced constant scrutiny, their authority undermined at every turn. The psychological toll was immense. Black soldiers felt as though they were engaged in two battles simultaneously, one against the enemy in the field and one against the systemic distrust of the very institution they served. And still, they pressed forward. Their perseverance in the face of such hostility became one of the quiet, defining acts of courage in the entire war. As combat operations intensified, cracks began to form in the Army's rigid racial edifice, not through policy, but through proximity. White officers who had previously doubted black soldiers began to see their capabilities firsthand. White enlisted men in desperate situations relied on black medics, black engineers, and black artillery crews who delivered under pressure. Slowly, grudging respect took root. Soldiers who had never questioned segregation before found themselves wrestling with the contradiction between what they had been taught and what they had witnessed. In foxholes and bombed-out farmhouses, the war forced a reckoning that peacetime America had long postponed. By late 1944, the Army could no longer deny what the battlefield made undeniable. Black soldiers were essential to victory. The next phase of the conflict would push them further into the center of the war effort, placing them face to face with Hitler's forces in some of the most pivotal engagements of the conflict. But as they prepared for this escalation, each soldier carried a truth carved deeply into memory. The enemy they would soon face in Europe was deadly, disciplined, and unrelenting. But the enemy they confronted within their own country was older, more insidious, and far harder to defeat. The months that followed were a crucible, one that reshaped thousands of young black men who had stepped forward believing service would grant them the dignity their country had long withheld. Training camps across the South and Midwest became their proving grounds, and for many, their first direct confrontation with the machinery of American racism in uniform. At bases like Fort Benning, Tuskegee, and Camp Claiborne, black recruits were drilled, disciplined, and molded into soldiers, often by white officers who doubted their intelligence, their courage, or even their right to wear the uniform. Yet beneath that constant scrutiny, black trainees pushed themselves harder, aware that failure would not be excused as individual weakness but framed as racial deficiency. Every mile run, every weapon cleaned, every drill perfected carried an unspoken weight. We must be twice as good just to be considered equal. Daily life in the camps reflected the contradictions of an army fighting for democracy abroad while enforcing segregation at home. There were separate barracks, separate latrines, separate mess halls, and in some towns surrounding the bases, separate bus lines or seating enforced by MPs. Fights broke out, sometimes sparked by slurs, sometimes by the brutality of military police, sometimes by nothing more than black soldiers refusing to defer. But within the black units themselves, a fierce sense of solidarity emerged. They created their own support networks, barbershops and converted storage rooms, informal debate circles, prayer groups, and card games that lasted long into the night. These makeshift communities didn't just ease loneliness, they fostered resilience. In a world that told them they weren't fit to serve, they built their own sources of pride. Still, training exposed the country's contradictions in sharper ways than many recruits had anticipated. Newspapers from Harlem, Chicago, and Pittsburgh reached the camps filled with stories about racial violence back home, lynchings, police brutality, job discrimination, and reminded soldiers that the uniform offered no shield. Some had wives, mothers, and sisters writing to them about landlords raising rents because your man is in the army, or factories refusing to hire black women even as war labor shortages grew severe. These letters were a lifeline, but also a burden. Soldiers were thousands of miles from home, preparing to fight fascism while powerless to fight the injustices their families endured. Leadership became another battleground. Black officers existed, but in numbers so small that many enlisted men could go months without seeing one. Some white officers were fair or even supportive. Others were openly hostile, cracking down on the smallest infractions, assigning demeaning tasks, or blocking promotions. Yet whenever black soldiers managed to rise, through perfect scores on technical tests, excellence in the field, or sheer determination, it sent ripples through the ranks. For many, seeing a black lieutenant or captain was a revelation. If he can stand there, maybe I can too. In spite of the obstacles, something transformative happened during these months. Black trainees became experts in artillery, aviation mechanics, logistics, and engineering, fields they had been excluded from in civilian life. The Army had long justified segregation by claiming black soldiers lacked the intellectual capacity for complex roles, but wartime necessity forced open doors previously sealed shut. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion mastered the delicate art of aerial defense. Black quartermasters kept entire divisions supplied, and the Tuskegee Airmen proved themselves among the most disciplined pilots ever trained. Each achievement chipped away at myths centuries old. Even so, discipline within the ranks remained astounding. Black units scored high on inspections and maintained near-perfect attendance records, even when morale sagged under discrimination. Drill instructors, sometimes black NCOs promoted from within, played a crucial role. They told their men, "Hold your head high. The world is watching." And they were right. Journalists from black newspapers visited bases and wrote glowing articles. Civic leaders toured camps and returned home urging communities to take pride in their soldiers. Slowly, the narrative shifted. These men were not just trainees. They were symbols of a future America struggling to be born. Yet the most profound transformation happened internally. Men who once worked as porters, farmhands, or factory laborers discovered strength, skill, and leadership they never knew they possessed. Training hardened their bodies, sharpened their minds, and gave them a sense of belonging denied to them in civilian life. But it also deepened their awareness of the country's failings. As one soldier wrote in a letter smuggled home, "The army is teaching me to fight. Maybe one day I will use that training to fight for my rights." Part 5 ends with black units preparing to leave the camps, heartbroken to leave home, eager to prove themselves, but carrying a dual mission no white unit faced. They were about to fight Hitler's racist empire abroad, while bracing to confront America's racist systems on their return. Their journey to the front lines was not just movement across distance, but across history. They were the vanguard of a transformation the country had long resisted. Black soldiers demanding to be treated not as laborers, not as inferiors, but as American men. When orders finally came down for deployment, black units across the country felt a mix of pride, anxiety, and a sobering sense of destiny. Boarding trains that rattled them toward coastal ports, soldiers watched the landscapes of homes slip away, cotton fields, industrial towns, crowded neighborhoods, and the familiar streets where they had been boys slowly dissolving into memory. Segregated railcars reminded them that even in transit, they were not traveling as equals. Yet as the trains rolled eastward toward Norfolk, New York, or Charleston, many felt a growing tension in their chests. This was their moment to prove themselves to the world. Like every soldier, they feared death. Unlike every soldier, they feared obscurity, feared that if they were not exceptional, the door they were forcing open would slam on the generations behind them. At the ports, chaos reigned. Cargo, crates, tanks, and vehicles filled the docks in towering piles, all destined for the expanding war in North Africa, Europe, or the Pacific. Black soldiers were often assigned the hardest manual labor upon arrival, loading ships, hauling gear, managing freight under the command of white officers who doubted their readiness for combat. But they also saw the scale of what lay ahead. The sheer size of the troop transports, floating cities capable of carrying thousands, made the reality undeniable. They were leaving the continent that had confined, segregated, and demeaned them. Ahead lay the unknown, Hitler's battalions, enemy submarines, and a world at war. And yet, for many, there was a strange sense of liberation. Overseas, they hoped, their service might be judged by merit rather than color. The voyage across the Atlantic was dangerous for every American on board, but especially for those in the lower decks. German U-boats prowled the ocean, and every soldier knew the statistics. A single torpedo, a single breach in the hull, and ships could sink within minutes. Black units were typically assigned the deepest quarters, cramped, humid, and foul-smelling, far below the waterline. Hammocks were stacked in triple tiers, corridors were narrow, and washrooms were overcrowded. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by drills, alarms, or the groans of the ship as it battled the ocean. Yet these conditions created a bond forged through shared hardship. They sang, prayed, and joked in the darkness, building a sense of unity stronger than any regulation the army could impose. Training continued even at sea. White officers drilled black soldiers on deck, sometimes fairly, sometimes harshly, under skies that stretched to the horizon. Rifle practice, anti-aircraft instruction, calisthenics, and emergency procedures became part of the ship's daily rhythm. Many soldiers realized that this was the first time the Army had invested in their combat readiness, not just their labor. Despite segregation, despite the skepticism, the war was forcing change. Black soldiers were learning the same tactics, the same weapons, the same battlefield skills as their white counterparts. And they took to it with intensity, determined to exceed every expectation placed upon them. Still, life aboard ship highlighted inequalities. Dining areas were segregated, with black soldiers often receiving smaller portions or eating at odd hours. Some white units treated the voyage as a kind of grim adventure, playing cards, writing letters, or lounging on deck. Black soldiers often had additional duties, cleaning, maintenance, or assisting in the boiler rooms. Yet even here, they found moments of pride. Many of them were skilled mechanics, electricians, or engineers from civilian life, and the ship's crew recognized their abilities. They fixed equipment, managed logistics, and kept essential systems running. Quietly, without fanfare, they proved indispensable. Nighttime was the most haunting part of the journey. The transports ran darkened, no lights allowed, because somewhere out there, German submarines waited. Soldiers listened to the hum of the engines, the slap of waves, and the creaking metal around them. Some wrote letters home by flashlight. Others whispered stories to keep fear at bay. Many thought about the double war they were fighting, the one ahead across the ocean and the one they had left behind in America. The irony was not lost on them. They were risking their lives to defend a democracy that had yet to defend them. On clear nights, some crept onto the upper decks to look at the stars, a luxury that felt almost holy. Under the constellations, the world felt larger, and so did their purpose. They weren't just crossing the ocean, they were crossing into history. Their grandparents had been denied education, denied land, denied political power, denied the rights they were now fighting to protect. And as the waves carried them toward Africa, England, or the Mediterranean, they understood something profound. If they proved themselves here, on the world stage, America would no longer be able to pretend they were unworthy of equality. The crossing hardened them, humbled them, and prepared them, not just for combat, but for the fight that would come after. Many didn't know what battlefield awaited them: Italy, France, the Pacific, or the deserts of North Africa. But they knew this. Once the ship reached the far shore, there would be no turning back. They would face Hitler's armies, Nazi ideology, and the deadliest war the world had ever seen. And they would do so carrying the hopes of millions of Black Americans who had never been allowed to serve freely, to fight openly, or to demand recognition. Part 6 ends as the convoy approaches its destination, whether Algiers, Liverpool, or Casablanca, and Black soldiers stand at the rails catching their first glimpse of foreign shores. Their hearts pound with fear and resolve. The first war, America's war against the Axis, was about to begin. The second war, the long struggle for equality at home, looms behind them like a shadow they can never outrun. For many Black soldiers, their first steps onto foreign soil felt almost surreal. The air smelled different, the language was unfamiliar, and the sky, even the sky, seemed to have a sharper edge. Yet the moment they left the docks, reality settled in with a weight that pressed against their ribs. This was a war zone. Trucks roared past with wounded men. Anti-aircraft guns stood ready along the roads, and the distant thud of artillery reminded them that the front lines were never far. For the first time, they felt the scale and urgency of a global conflict that stretched far beyond American shores. They were no longer laborers or support personnel. They were soldiers in a foreign land, marching toward the unknown. Black combat units, such as the 92nd Infantry Division and the 761st Tank Battalion, were among the first to experience the brutal learning curve of modern warfare. They quickly discovered that the battlefield had none of the rigid boundaries the Army's segregation imposed. Artillery shells didn't distinguish between white or black soldiers. Mortars didn't pause to consider rank or race. And German machine guns, when they opened fire, treated every man equally. In the chaos of their first engagements, whether in the hills of Italy, the hedgerows of France, or the deserts of North Africa, Black soldiers learned the truth that veterans had whispered for generations. Fear sharpens the senses, but survival depends on discipline, instinct, and trust. No amount of discrimination could overshadow that primal bond forged under fire. The shock of first combat was overwhelming. Enemy fire cracked overhead. The ground trembled under exploding shells, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with dirt and sweat. Many Black units entered these moments with the weight of expectation on their shoulders. White officers doubting their capabilities, military leadership assigning them to secondary roles, and journalists often ignoring their contributions entirely. Yet when the fighting started, they fought with a ferocity born not only of duty, but of defiance. They advanced through ambushes, held positions under impossible pressure, and rescued wounded comrades with no hesitation. Those who had once doubted them found themselves relying on them for survival. The first losses struck like hammer blows. When a fellow soldier fell, someone who had shared the cramped bunks on the transport ship, who had laughed through patrol drills, who had carried the same burdens. The reality of war pierced deeper than any bullet. Black soldiers gathered around makeshift graves, helmets in hand, listening to chaplains recite prayers that struggled to contain the grief swelling in their chests. Many realized something profound. The men they mourned would be honored as American heroes abroad, yet would return to the same segregated cemeteries, the same divided towns, and the same unequal nation they had left behind. The contradiction seared itself into their souls. Still, despite the loss and fear, the battlefield revealed something unexpected, resilience far greater than the army had anticipated. Black units, often given outdated equipment and inadequate supplies, devised makeshift solutions that showcased their ingenuity. Mechanics cannibalized wrecked vehicles to keep tanks running. Medics improvised treatments under fire. Infantrymen learned to maneuver through terrain that forced adaptation with every step. Their survival depended not on privilege, but on problem-solving, a skill many had honed their entire lives in a segregated society where nothing came easy. Recognition, slow and reluctant, began to surface. White officers who had harbored doubts found themselves praising the discipline and coordination of black platoons. Allied commanders noted the performance of black artillery batteries whose accuracy saved entire regiments. And word began to spread, quietly at first, then more boldly, that these soldiers were not merely meeting expectations, they were surpassing them. The war, indifferent to bias, was exposing the truth. Courage and capability paid no mind to skin color. Yet with every victory came a conflicting internal ache. Black soldiers felt pride in their service, but that pride coexisted with bitterness. They realized they were fighting two enemies, one wearing a swastika and the other wearing the uniform of their own country. Prejudice didn't vanish in battle. Some were barred from officers' clubs. Others were denied field promotions. Segregated blood plasma, segregated medical wards, segregated latrines, all persisted even while shells exploded overhead. The absurdity of risking their lives for a nation that segmented their humanity was a wound that deepened with every engagement. Still, amidst the contradictions, something transformative began to take shape. Combat had forced white and black soldiers into circumstances where survival depended on mutual reliance. And when a man saves your life in battle, prejudice fractures. Shared danger had a way of stripping away illusions and exposing truths. On the battlefield, black soldiers were beginning to earn the recognition that had been withheld for generations. Not because the army suddenly embraced equality, but because their actions left no room for doubt. In fire, steel, and sacrifice, they were reshaping the identity of the American fighting man and altering the trajectory of civil rights long before the war was even over. As the war expanded across continents, black soldiers found themselves thrust into roles where failure would have been catastrophic for the Allied cause. Yet success brought them little recognition. In Italy, France, Burma, and the Pacific, they built bridges under fire, drove supply convoys across roads shelled daily by German artillery, operated anti-aircraft guns that shielded entire divisions, and ran quartermaster depots that fed armies 1 million men strong. Their labor sustained the machinery of war, but their names rarely appeared in official reports. Even in victory, their contributions remained largely invisible, buried under layers of institutional prejudice. But the men themselves knew what they had done, and so did the soldiers who depended on them. In the skies over Europe, the Tuskegee Airmen battled not just German fighters, but the racism of the very nation they defended. Their first missions were met with quiet skepticism from white commanders skeptical of their abilities. Yet their performance, tight formations, disciplined tactics, and an unparalleled commitment to protecting bombers soon forced a reckoning. Bomber crews who once doubted them began saying prayers of gratitude when they saw the red-tailed fighters sweeping into position beside them. They didn't need medals or headlines to know their worth. The trust of the crews who returned home alive because of them was validation enough. But the battlefield was not just won by pilots and infantry. Black engineers in the 93rd and 95th Engineer Regiments carved supply lines out of jungles and deserts with little more than hand tools and explosive charges. In Burma, they hacked through dense undergrowth for miles a day, fighting disease, exhaustion, and relentless monsoon rains. They built bridges over rivers that rose overnight and constructed roads across mountains where one wrong step could mean death. Their work enabled Allied forces to move, fight, and ultimately triumph. Without them, the war in Asia would likely have ground to a halt. Their heroism was not glamorous, but it was essential. The Pacific Theater brought new trials. Black Marines of the Montford Point battalions found themselves fighting across islands where every ridge and cave concealed Japanese troops sworn to die rather than surrender. When the U.S. needed manpower for beach landings, ammunition depots, and perimeter defense, Montford Point Marines stepped into roles once deemed unsuitable for black troops. Under blistering heat and constant threat of ambush, they proved again and again that their courage matched any Marine in the Corps' history. Their reward, however, was often silence. The Marine Corps resisted integrating them into regular units, even as their performance shattered every racist myth that had justified exclusion. Back in Europe, black medical personnel served in clearing stations and evacuation hospitals where the wounded arrived in endless waves. Nurses of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, educated, disciplined, and determined, sorted millions of pieces of backlogged mail, restoring morale across an entire theater of war. Their work seems mundane until one understands its impact. Letters from home kept men fighting, kept hope alive, and kept the war machine functioning. The 6,888th did what no other unit could, and they did it faster and more efficiently than anyone expected. Their reward? Discrimination, cramped barracks, and pressure to outperform white units just to receive the same basic respect. Perhaps the most overlooked were the truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, black men who drove day and night along dangerous, muddy, overburdened roads to supply the armies racing across France after the breakout from Normandy. They faced constant Luftwaffe attacks, mechanical breakdowns, exhaustion, and the deadly chaos of wartime traffic. Yet they kept moving. Without them, American spearheads would have stalled, tanks would have run dry, and the Allied advance would have faltered. Many never fired a shot in anger, but their courage lay in relentless forward motion under conditions that killed men as surely as bullets. Despite their extraordinary service, these soldiers lived with the knowledge that their heroism would likely be minimized, misattributed, or forgotten entirely once the war ended. They were aware that official histories would often feature white commanders, white units, and white heroes, while they remained footnotes, if mentioned at all. And yet they pushed forward with a resolve shaped by generations of struggle. They weren't just fighting Hitler, they were fighting erasure. Their victories were acts of preservation, of dignity, of identity, of legacy. The war had become a testing ground not just for weapons and tactics, but for the nation's conscience. Black soldiers understood that every bridge they built, every convoy they drove, every enemy position they overran was evidence, undeniable, irrefutable evidence, that the arguments used to justify segregation were lies. Every task they completed, no matter how overlooked, undermined the foundations of a racist system that had endured for centuries. And though they did not yet know it, their invisible valor would become the spark that lit the fuse of the modern civil rights movement, proving once and for all that equality could never again be denied without confronting the truths written in blood, sweat, sacrifice, and service. Black soldiers entered combat under a unique psychological burden. Every bullet they fired, every position they held, every wound they endured became a referendum on their humanity. They knew that white commanders, newspapers back home, and political leaders would judge their entire race by their performance. With that crushing weight pressing on their shoulders, they stepped into battlefields where the enemy did not care about American racism, only about killing whoever wore the uniform. That brutal equality of danger became a strange and terrible liberation. On the front lines, segregation dissolved into smoke and fire. Whether a man lived or died depended not on the color of his skin, but on his ability to fight, to think, and to survive. And in that crucible, black soldiers proved themselves again and again. In Italy, the 92nd Infantry Division faced determined German defenders entrenched in mountain ridges that had broken armies for centuries. The terrain was unforgiving, steep slopes, icy passes, and narrow valleys that turned every advance into a gauntlet of mines and machine guns. Despite inconsistent leadership and often being assigned the most difficult sectors, the men pushed forward with tenacity born of necessity. They captured villages, repelled counterattacks, and seized positions that German commanders assumed were impregnable. Their early setbacks, often misattributed to race rather than poor strategic planning, were used by biased officers as justification for doubt. Yet their eventual successes shattered those assumptions with undeniable force. Meanwhile, in France, the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, made history as one of the most battle-hardened armored units of the European War. Their Sherman tanks rolled day and night, providing cover for infantry, smashing through German lines, and executing maneuvers that demanded both precision and courage. They fought under Patton, a general whose views on race were complicated at best, but who recognized their value on the battlefield. Their record spoke louder than prejudice. Nearly 200 days of continuous combat, helping liberate towns, rescuing trapped units, and pursuing retreating German forces deep into enemy territory. No amount of discrimination could obscure their battlefield achievements. The Pacific presented entirely different horrors. Japanese forces fought with ferocity unmatched in the European theater, and black units serving in the Pacific learned quickly that the enemy rarely surrendered. Combat was often intimate, fought in choking jungles where visibility vanished after a few feet, where ambushes came from trees, canopies, and caves. Montford Point Marines, tasked with both support and combat roles, found themselves defending airfields, repelling night assaults, and engaging in firefights that demanded instant reaction. They had trained separately, endured prejudice separately, but in battle they proved indistinguishable in courage from any Marine who had stormed Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima. Those who served in artillery and anti-aircraft units fought battles most Americans never heard about. Black gunners shot down aircraft during nighttime raids, saved supply depots from destruction, and defended ports vital to Allied logistics. When German bombers descended through the clouds, they fired without hesitation, often under poor visibility and intense pressure. Their accuracy infuriated enemy pilots. Their discipline impressed white observers who had doubted them. And yet, when commendations were handed out, black soldiers were too often omitted from the awards lists. The injustice stung, but it never stopped them from fighting. Prisoners of war who encountered black units reported their surprise at the soldiers' professionalism. Clear proof that Nazi propaganda about American racial hierarchies was a lie. Some captives even expressed gratitude after being treated respectfully by black American guards, a profound irony considering the discrimination those same soldiers faced from their own countrymen. On the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, black soldiers became living contradictions to fascist ideology. They embodied the democratic ideals America proclaimed, even as America denied those ideals to them at home. In the smoke and chaos of war, the illusion of racial superiority held by many white American officers began to crack. When black medics saved white soldiers, when black artillery protected white units from annihilation, when black infantry advanced under withering fire to rescue pinned-down platoons, the truth became unavoidable. Military segregation was not only unjust, it was inefficient, irrational, and deeply damaging to the war effort. Commanders who once sidelined black units found themselves requesting their support, relying on their expertise, and praising their bravery in moments that could not be ignored or covered up. But even as black soldiers proved their valor on the battlefield, they carried a painful awareness with them. They knew that once the guns fell silent, they would return to a nation that might still treat them as second-class citizens. They fought valiantly against foreign tyranny, while knowing full well that the struggle for freedom at home awaited them with equal ferocity. Yet this realization did not break them, it fueled them. Every advance, every victory, every act of courage became more than just military service. It became testimony, evidence that the fight for civil rights would not be built on petitions alone, but on the sacrifices of men who had earned equality in the harshest tribunal on earth, the battlefield. Even far from home, black soldiers could not escape the force of American racism. Instead, it followed them across oceans and battlefields, threading its way through every camp, barracks, and command post. The U.S. Army remained rigidly segregated, even as it touted democracy abroad. In England, black troops were stunned to find white American military police enforcing Jim Crow norms on a population that did not share them. British civilians invited black soldiers to dances, pubs, and homes with a friendliness many had never experienced. But American officers pushed back, establishing segregated canteens, enforcing separate seating on buses, and reprimanding white troops who socialized too comfortably with black counterparts. The contradiction was everywhere. The army demanded unity on the battlefield but insisted on division everywhere else. The hypocrisy smoldered in the minds of black soldiers who saw, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that the world was not the problem. America was. Racial violence erupted more than once within the ranks. Fights broke out in camps as white soldiers, enraged by the sight of black troops receiving the respect of local civilians, provoked conflict. In several towns across Britain, military police sided predictably with white aggressors, arresting black soldiers who had simply defended themselves. These incidents left deep scars. Black soldiers felt betrayed by the very system they were risking their lives to protect. And yet, instead of breaking their resolve, these injustices hardened their determination. They understood they were being tested, not only as soldiers, but as representatives of a future America they hoped to forge. Their restraint, their dignity under provocation, became acts of resistance as vital as anything they accomplished under fire. Segregation also shaped the distribution of military resources. Black units were often given outdated or poorly maintained equipment, while white units received newer rifles, better trucks, and more reliable radios. Even ammunition allocation could reflect bias. Some black infantry companies went into combat with fewer rounds per man than their white counterparts. Tankers in the 761st sometimes received hand-me-down Shermans that required constant repairs. And yet these same units consistently exceeded expectations. The men learned to improvise, to coax performance from failing engines, to scavenge spare parts from destroyed vehicles, and to fight with whatever they had. Their resilience became a quiet indictment of a military culture that had underestimated them at every turn. Prejudice infected the chain of command as well. Black officers were rare, and many white officers assigned to black units viewed the post as punishment rather than responsibility. Some openly doubted the ability of black soldiers, offering little guidance or support. Others, inexperienced or incompetent, made tactical errors that cost lives, mistakes later blamed on the supposed shortcomings of their troops. But there were also exceptional leaders who saw beyond race, who recognized talent, who inspired loyalty through fairness rather than fear. When these officers emerged, black units flourished. Their presence proved what black soldiers already knew. Leadership was not a function of skin color, but of character and competence. Military police disproportionately targeted black soldiers, enforcing discipline with a severity rarely applied to white troops. Curfew violations, minor scuffles, or perceived insolence could lead to harsh punishment. Black soldiers walking alone in towns patrolled by white MPs often faced interrogation or arrest without cause. The threat of being jailed for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time hung over them constantly. This pattern of harassment mirrored the racial policing they knew from home, a bitter reminder that even in uniform, with government-issued weapons and government-issued authority, they were still seen as threats by the nation they served. Yet these struggles created a unity within black units unmatched by many others in the army. They leaned on one another for strength, support, and affirmation. Shared pain forged deep bonds. Friendships built not just on proximity, but on mutual understanding of the double burden they carried. They trained together, fought together, laughed together, and mourned together. Their sense of brotherhood became a shield against the hostility that surrounded them, and many would later describe their wartime units as families in a way they had never experienced before or after. Importantly, these internal battles did not stay hidden. Observers from the black press, journalists from publications like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and the Baltimore Afro-American, traveled overseas to document the experiences of black soldiers. Their dispatches revealed the truth of discriminatory treatment and elevated the stories of unsung heroes. These accounts flowed back into black communities across America, galvanizing support for the Double Victory campaign. Victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. The courage, suffering, and excellence of black soldiers became powerful moral ammunition in the growing movement for civil rights. By the time these soldiers had endured prejudice within the ranks, survived battles against some of the world's most formidable armies, and faced hostility from their own comrades, a transformation had taken place. They had come to understand that the war they were fighting was bigger than Hitler, bigger than the Axis, bigger even than the conflict itself. They were fighting to redefine what it meant to be American. And with every indignity endured, every injustice confronted, and every victory achieved in spite of systemic barriers, they moved one step closer to reshaping the nation awaiting them back home. As black soldiers fought on distant battlefields, the concept of the double V, victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism, became more than a slogan. It became a living mandate. Letters from the front, printed in black newspapers, recounted both heroism and humiliation. Men described towns liberated from Axis control while simultaneously lamenting the segregation that persisted in American military bases. They began to see the connection between their sacrifices overseas and the pressing need to dismantle systemic oppression back home. Every mission completed, every enemy position seized, became symbolic. They were proving to the world, and to their own nation, that American democracy was not yet fully realized. In Italy and France, black infantry units continued to endure grueling conditions, often assigned the most hazardous frontline operations. Their courage under fire became legendary among those who witnessed it firsthand. Despite being issued outdated weapons or being forced into supply lines with limited reinforcements, they advanced through minefields, enemy ambushes, and artillery barrages. Each successful engagement reinforced a quiet truth. These men were just as capable, just as brave, and just as essential as any white soldier in the Allied ranks. Yet official reports often overlooked their contributions, reinforcing the need for their deeds to speak louder than any official recognition could. Tank battalions, like the 761st, continued to shatter preconceived notions of black military effectiveness. Their Shermans led spearheads across enemy territory, rescuing trapped infantry and neutralizing fortified positions. Casualty reports often minimized their role or reassigned credit to white units. But eyewitness accounts tell a different story. Black tank crews were fearless, coordinated, and decisive. Their success forced even the most skeptical commanders to adjust strategies and trust black soldiers in increasingly critical operations. Battlefields became classrooms where prejudice gave way to necessity, and necessity often revealed undeniable competence. The Tuskegee Airmen also achieved remarkable milestones during this period. Escorting bombers over heavily defended German targets, they faced elite Luftwaffe pilots and navigated treacherous skies. Their disciplined formations ensured a significantly lower loss rate for bombers under their protection compared to other escort units. Despite initial skepticism, their accomplishments earned them the respect of fellow airmen and commanders alike. Yet the recognition was uneven, award citations were limited, and media coverage rarely matched the scale of their achievement. Still, each safe return to base reinforced the double V ethos. Black soldiers could achieve victory abroad while laying the moral foundation for victory at home. The challenges were not confined to combat units. Black nurses, medics, and support personnel labored in the shadows, tending to the wounded with expertise and compassion. Their work saved lives daily, yet they often faced discrimination in promotions, assignments, and living conditions. In the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, black women processed mountains of backlogged mail, restoring morale across entire theaters. Their dedication reinforced the broader truth of the war. Contributions to victory were not always measured by bullets fired or positions taken. The war effort depended on every soldier, and black personnel frequently carried a disproportionate load under the weight of both combat and prejudice. Every success at the front highlighted the hypocrisy of the homeland. Newspapers and civilian leaders began to recognize a stark contradiction. Black soldiers were defending the freedoms of Europe while being denied basic rights in their own country. Community leaders and civil rights advocates leveraged these stories to demand changes in military policy and in American society. The letters, reports, and testimonies of black servicemen became moral ammunition in the fight for equality. Their victories abroad amplified the call for integration, fair treatment, and recognition at home. The psychological burden of this dual fight weighed heavily on many soldiers. They were acutely aware that surviving the horrors of foreign battlefields did not guarantee justice upon their return. Yet this awareness also steeled their resolve. Each mission completed and each enemy position taken became a message. Black Americans were indispensable to the war effort and deserved full citizenship in the land they defended. Courage became both a weapon and a statement, and every act of service was a building block for the civil rights revolution that would follow. By the end of this phase of the war, Black soldiers had transformed both themselves and the perception of their capabilities. They had endured segregation, prejudice, and suspicion while excelling in every arena, from combat to logistics, from the skies to the seas. Their triumphs abroad became an unanswerable argument against racial injustice at home. And as the Allies pressed deeper into Axis territory, Black soldiers prepared for the final, most consequential battles, carrying with them the dual imperatives of defeating tyranny abroad and challenging inequality at home. By 1944, the tide of the war had turned, and Black units were increasingly drawn into pivotal operations across Europe. The 92nd Infantry Division pressed through the rugged Italian Apennines, often tasked with the steepest climbs, the most exposed valleys, and the heaviest German defenses. Their orders were clear: hold lines, secure villages, and advance relentlessly. What was not clear to many white officers was that these men were already carrying a heavier burden than most, fighting not just the enemy, but the skepticism of their own command. Yet time and again, Black soldiers exceeded expectations, capturing strategic positions that had stymied white units and leaving a trail of astonished allies and confounded adversaries. In France, the Red Ball Express, a logistical marvel almost entirely staffed by Black drivers, became essential to the rapid advance following the Normandy breakout. Convoys moved day and night along perilous roads, dodging mines, navigating shell-damaged bridges, and evading sporadic enemy attacks. Every truck carried fuel, ammunition, or rations, the lifeblood of the advancing armies. Drivers worked in shifts that blurred day into night, sleep into exhaustion, and danger into routine. Accidents, ambushes, and mechanical failures were constants. Yet these men kept moving, knowing that a single delay could cost thousands of lives. Their courage and tenacity made them the unsung heroes of the European theater, a critical force behind the Allies' ability to maintain momentum. Tank units, like the 761st, continued to demonstrate extraordinary skill and adaptability in the closing campaigns. Maneuvering through the shattered villages and forested terrain of Germany, they engaged enemy armor, broke through fortified positions, and rescued encircled infantry units. Each success solidified their reputation as one of the most effective armored units of the war. Yet accolades were still scarce, and their heroism often went unrecorded in official reports. Despite this, the men understood the stakes. Every maneuver executed flawlessly, every convoy secured, was evidence of their undeniable competence and resilience. The Tuskegee Airmen, meanwhile, completed thousands of sorties, often escorting bomber groups on missions that were historically perilous. Their discipline in formation flying, their refusal to abandon bombers, and their tactical ingenuity forced recognition even from the highest-ranking commanders. The Red Tails' victories reduced bomber losses dramatically, challenging assumptions about race and skill. For many white crews, the sight of these Black pilots overhead became synonymous with survival. And yet, even as the military witnessed their effectiveness, broader integration remained distant. These pilots were demonstrating, under the harshest conditions, what equality and capability truly meant. Combat support units also left indelible marks on the final campaigns. Black medical teams operated field hospitals, triaging massive numbers of casualties, often under shellfire or during sudden enemy counterattacks. Engineers repaired bridges within hours of destruction, cleared mines, and rebuilt infrastructure critical to the movement of men and material. Their expertise ensured that frontline units could continue fighting, that supply lines remained open, and that operations moved with relentless precision. Every successful mission was a silent testament. Black soldiers were indispensable, even if their sacrifices went unnoticed by the broader public. The psychological dimension of these campaigns cannot be overstated. Black soldiers navigated the dual pressures of combat stress and systemic discrimination. Letters home described the horrors of battle intertwined with frustration over segregation, unequal pay, and limited promotion. Yet these men found ways to assert dignity. Informal leadership within platoons, mentoring younger soldiers, and creating rituals of solidarity that reinforced morale. Humor, music, and camaraderie became survival tools as vital as any weapon. Through this, Black soldiers transformed adversity into cohesion, forging units capable of extraordinary endurance under the most challenging circumstances. Recognition, when it arrived, was often piecemeal and delayed. Some units received citations, a handful of individuals were decorated, but the war ended before many of the highest honors were awarded or even considered. Still, eyewitness accounts, letters, and oral histories preserved a record of valor that official reports largely ignored. The legacy of these soldiers would not rest in paperwork, but in the profound impact they had on the battlefield, the morale of their fellow troops, and the broader trajectory of American society. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany, Black soldiers had earned the respect of commanders, the admiration of allies, and the fear of adversaries. Their journey had been defined not just by combat, but by perseverance in the face of systemic injustice. In every engagement, they proved that skill, courage, and determination could not be constrained by color. And as the war entered its final months, these men carried forward a legacy that would resonate far beyond the battlefield. They had fought for victory abroad, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for the long struggle for equality at home. As the guns fell silent across Europe and the Pacific, Black soldiers returned home carrying medals, scars, and memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Yet the reception they encountered was starkly different from the heroes' welcome promised in recruitment posters. Towns and cities remained segregated. Restaurants, theaters, and public spaces barred them from entry. White officers who had once depended on their courage often avoided interaction, and the country that had praised their valor abroad hesitated to recognize it at home. The contradiction was painfully clear. They had fought for freedoms they themselves had yet to fully enjoy. In southern states, the disparity was especially jarring. Veterans returned to Jim Crow laws, restricted voting rights, and communities where intimidation and violence were commonplace. In some cases, men who had earned high military honors abroad were denied jobs or promotions solely because of their race. Many Black soldiers had to confront a bitter reality. The war had tested them, honed their skills, and proven their worth on a global stage, but the nation's social order remained resistant to change. Letters, diaries, and interviews reveal men wrestling with frustration, disbelief, and determination. They understood that the battle for equality was far from over. It had only begun. In northern cities, the experience was slightly different, but no less complex. Industrial opportunities existed, especially during wartime labor shortages, yet Black veterans often found themselves passed over for promotions in favor of white counterparts. Neighborhoods were segregated by practice, if not by law, and the sense of alienation persisted. Many veterans formed or joined civic organizations, leveraging their experience, discipline, and leadership to fight for better schools, housing, and employment opportunities. Their wartime experience had given them skills, networks, and confidence they would now apply to the civil rights struggle. The federal government's response to returning Black soldiers was limited. Programs like the GI Bill were technically available to all veterans, yet local implementation often discriminated against African Americans. Black veterans faced barriers to home loans, education, and employment assistance, highlighting the systemic inequities that had persisted throughout their military service. While some succeeded, many others were forced to navigate bureaucracies that seemed determined to maintain the status quo. The promise of a better life was thus filtered through the lens of racial prejudice, revealing that victory overseas did not automatically translate to victory at home. Despite these obstacles, Black veterans became a driving force for social change. The experience of disciplined, competent service under fire provided them with a powerful claim to citizenship and equality. Community leaders and activists pointed to their military record as evidence that African Americans had earned the right to full participation in American democracy. The Double V campaign, born during the war, now gained renewed urgency. Veterans marched, organized, and testified to the injustices they had endured, using the moral authority of their service to demand recognition and reform. At the personal level, returning soldiers faced profound psychological challenges. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress from combat experiences compounded by the sting of discrimination at home. Friendships forged in battle became anchors, as men sought support and understanding among those who had shared their trials. Yet, in the midst of personal and collective struggle, the sense of purpose cultivated during the war endured. Black veterans recognized that their service had altered perceptions, shattered myths of inferiority, and provided irrefutable proof of their capabilities. The legacy of these soldiers extended beyond immediate civil rights advocacy. Their bravery challenged white Americans to reconcile national ideals with reality. Their stories began to filter into schools, newspapers, and eventually history books, offering tangible evidence of African Americans' contributions to democracy. Communities celebrated their service through parades, monuments, and oral histories, even when official recognition lacked. These acts preserved the memory of their sacrifices and ensured that future generations could draw inspiration from their courage. Ultimately, the return home was not a conclusion, but the opening chapter of a new struggle. Black soldiers had fought and survived the deadliest conflict in human history. They had faced the most formidable armies in the world and demonstrated valor, skill, and resilience at every turn. And yet, the battle for dignity, equality, and recognition in their own country awaited them with equal intensity. Their service had proven their worth to the world, but now they had to prove it to their own nation, a challenge that would define the next generation of American history. The legacy of Black soldiers in World War II extended far beyond the battlefields where they had proved their courage. Their service became a powerful symbol in the struggle for civil rights, a living argument against segregation, discrimination, and systemic oppression. Veterans returned with a newfound confidence, organizational skills, and a deep understanding of leadership forged under fire. They became community leaders, educators, activists, and role models, embodying a truth that could no longer be ignored. African Americans had proven themselves capable of equal contribution to the nation, both in war and in society. In cities across the United States, veterans organizations sprang up to support returning soldiers, advocate for civil rights, and preserve the memory of Black military service. Chapters of the NAACP, the American Legion, and new groups like the Congress of Racial Equality drew heavily on veterans' leadership and experience. These men, many of whom had led men into combat, now led campaigns against discriminatory hiring practices, unequal education, and voting restrictions. Their military experience had taught them discipline, strategy, and perseverance, tools that proved invaluable in the fight for equality. The Double V campaign evolved into a moral and political touchstone, linking the sacrifices of war to the ongoing struggle for civil rights. Newspapers chronicled both victories abroad and ongoing injustices at home, providing a narrative that resonated with millions. The story of Black soldiers, often overlooked in official accounts, became a weapon in the battle against segregation. It was impossible to argue that African Americans were unfit for citizenship, leadership, or responsibility when these men had risked life and limb to secure freedom for the world. Their service was living proof that the nation's promises of equality were long overdue. The integration of the U.S. military in 1948, ordered by President Truman, was a direct consequence of the undeniable performance of Black soldiers during World War II. The valor, competence, and perseverance displayed across multiple theaters of war had shattered myths of racial inferiority that persisted in both military and civilian life. While integration did not erase prejudice overnight, it marked a turning point, a formal acknowledgement that Black soldiers could no longer be relegated to the margins. They had earned not just medals, but respect and recognition that forced institutional change. Beyond the military, the visibility of Black soldiers influenced broader cultural and social shifts. Communities honored returning veterans with parades, ceremonies, and memorials that recognize their contributions, sometimes for the first time. Popular media, though slow to catch up, gradually began to reflect the reality of African American participation in the war. Their stories inspired a generation of young African Americans, instilling pride and a sense of possibility. The war had become a crucible not only for military skill, but for identity, courage, and hope. Yet the psychological and social scars endured. Veterans carried the trauma of combat, loss, and systemic injustice throughout their lives. Many struggled to reconcile the stark contrast between their heroism abroad and their treatment at home. These experiences, however, reinforced their commitment to change. They became educators of the next generation, activists in their communities, and voices of conscience in a nation that had asked them to fight for freedoms it had long denied them. Their courage became both a weapon and a shield in the long fight for justice. The influence of Black World War II soldiers rippled into subsequent conflicts as well. Korean War and Vietnam War veterans benefited from the trail blazed by their predecessors, stepping into roles in integrated units, often serving as leaders and mentors. The standard set during World War II created a benchmark of excellence that could not be ignored, and each successive generation of Black servicemen and women built on the legacy established by those who had endured the dual battle of global war and domestic injustice. By the mid-20th century, the story of Black soldiers in World War II had become inseparable from the broader narrative of American progress. Their heroism abroad, their endurance in the face of prejudice, and their contributions to victory forced the nation to confront its contradictions. The war had exposed the lie of racial hierarchy and provided a powerful foundation for the civil rights victories that would follow. In proving themselves indispensable on foreign soil, Black soldiers had also proven, undeniably, that freedom and equality were not just ideals to be preached, they were rights to be claimed and defended at home. As World War II drew to a close, the service of Black soldiers stood as a paradox. Undeniable in its significance, yet often unrecognized in the official records and public memory. They had fought under the harshest conditions, faced enemies who sought their destruction, and persevered through an American military and society that doubted their worth. Their courage, skill, and sacrifice were indisputable, yet the full acknowledgement of their contributions would take decades. Even so, the impact of their service reverberated through every subsequent battle for equality, laying a foundation for transformative social change that reached far beyond the war itself. The legacy of their combat achievements became a source of pride and a rallying point for the African American community. Stories of bravery, ingenuity, and resilience circulated in newspapers, community meetings, and families' oral histories. Men who had stormed beaches, led convoys, and flown perilous missions shared experiences that challenged stereotypes and inspired younger generations. The knowledge that their fathers, brothers, and uncles had faced the horrors of modern warfare with dignity and excellence infused a renewed sense of purpose into communities that had long been denied full participation in American life. Black veterans emerged as leaders in the early civil rights movement. Their military experience endowed them with leadership, organizational skills, and a moral authority that proved invaluable in challenging segregation, discrimination, and voter suppression. Many took active roles in organizations like the NAACP, CORE, and later the SCLC, using the credibility earned on foreign battlefields to demand justice at home. They carried the lesson of the war into the struggle for civil rights. Courage and sacrifice must be met with action, and equality must be claimed, not waited for. The integration of the armed forces in 1948, ordered by President Truman, was a direct and lasting outcome of Black soldiers' performance during the war. The proof was irrefutable. They had excelled in every theater, in every role, under circumstances that tested human endurance and ingenuity. Segregation in the military, once defended by prejudice and bureaucratic inertia, could no longer be justified. This historic step toward equality in the armed forces foreshadowed the wider societal transformations that would accelerate during the 1950s and 1960s, setting the stage for civil rights victories that reshaped the nation. Culturally, the presence and performance of Black soldiers began to shift perceptions both abroad and at home. Allied civilians and soldiers from other nations witnessed firsthand the competence and bravery of African Americans, challenging myths of racial inferiority that had been used to justify discrimination. At home, while recognition was slow, communities began to celebrate the contributions of Black servicemen through parades, monuments, and public ceremonies. Literature, film, and journalism gradually acknowledged their heroism, although full historical recognition would take decades. The experience of combat also forged a profound sense of self-worth among returning soldiers. They had been tested against the deadliest armies in history, survived impossible odds, and carried themselves with distinction despite systemic prejudice. That experience of proven capability and courage provided an unassailable foundation for challenging inequality in civilian life. Veterans' voices gained moral weight in debates over labor rights, voting access, and educational opportunities, turning battlefield valor into societal leverage. Despite enduring personal trauma, systemic injustice, and the slow pace of recognition, Black soldiers of World War II reshaped the American narrative. Their service demonstrated that equality was not merely aspirational. It was practical, moral, and essential. Every convoy driven, every mission flown, every hill captured, every life saved, became evidence that African Americans were indispensable to the nation they defended. Their achievements demanded acknowledgement, and eventually, they received it, not just in medals or citations, but in the transformative social and political movements they helped ignite. Ultimately, the story of Black soldiers in World War II is a testament to resilience, courage, and moral clarity. They fought a war on two fronts, against the Axis abroad and against racial injustice at home. Their victories in both realms were intertwined, proving that heroism cannot be contained by prejudice and that true victory is measured not only by military conquest, but by the expansion of justice and human dignity. Their legacy endures, reminding the world that the fight for freedom and equality is inseparable, and that the sacrifices of those who came before continue to illuminate the path toward a more just society.